So we're going to solve this inequality. In order to do so, I'm going to move this 3x to the other side. And I have x cubed plus 2x squared minus 3x is greater than equal to 0. Now I'm going to continue factoring this. These can all be divided by an x. So x will be on the outside. I'm left with x squared plus 2x minus 3 is greater than or equal to 0. And if you continued factoring this, we can do an eye chart. Two numbers that multiply to negative 3 and add to 2 are 3 and negative 1. 3 times negative 1 is negative 3, and they add to give you 2. So this will be x times x plus 3 times x minus 1 needs to be greater than or equal to 0. So if I were to solve for 0, I would have the numbers x is 0, negative 3, and 1 from these factors. If I set those three factors equal to 0 and solved it, these are the x values that I would get. However, we don't want, this would be my answer if this was an equal sign. However, we have an inequality symbol, so this is not going to be our answer. So I'm going to put my solutions into a number line from least to greatest. So negative 3, 0 is around here, 1 is around here. I'm going to look at what values would give me greater than or equal to 0 if I plugged it into these factors. Okay, so let's try negative 5. I'm going to plug in negative 5 into here. Let me clean this up a bit. Okay, so let's plug in negative 5s into these x values. Negative 5, negative 5, negative 5. I'm testing values that are smaller than negative 3. Okay, let's see if these will give me greater than or equal to 0. So I have negative 5 times negative 2 times a negative 6. This is a positive 10 times a negative 6. That gave me negative 60. Is that greater than or equal to 0? So that means this side gave me negatives. We won't include that in our answer because we want answers that will give me greater than or equal to 0 if we plug it in. Let's test some values between negative 3 and 0. What number would you guys like to test? Okay, I heard y'all say negative 2, so let's plug in a negative 2 this time. I'll plug in a negative 2. So I get negative 2, this will be 1, and this will be negative 3. This is negative 2 times 1 is negative 2, times a negative 3 is what? A positive 6. Is that greater than or equal to 0? That worked. It gave us a positive answer between negative 3 and 0, so we can include that in our answer. Let's test between 0 and 1. What do you guys want to test? I'll make it easy and do a half. Okay, so let's test the half. We want to see if we'll be greater than or equal to 0 if I plug in a number between 0 and 1. So we're going to plug in a half. We get a half times 3.5 times a half minus 1 is negative 0.5. Is our answer going to be positive or negative? It'll be a negative answer. So this is negative. So we don't want to include this in our domain or in our answer. Now let's test this side. We're going to test numbers bigger than 1. So I'll just plug in a 2. So we'll plug in 2 into our exponents. Into our x's. Let's plug in a 2 for our x values. So we get 2 times 5 times 1. Will this be positive? Is it going to be greater than or equal to 0? Yep, so it works. So the values that gave me a positive answer greater than or equal to 0 were between negative 3 and 0 and numbers bigger than 1. So this is your solution interval. My solutions are in this interval. And notice I included brackets because I can be equal to 0. -3, 0, and 1 will give you 0. And we can be equal to 0. It has a line underneath the inequality. That's why I have brackets. So I want you guys to try to do these problems. Give me the solution interval. All right, so for this one, we should have factored this. 256 is a perfect square. It's 16 times 16. Okay, and we can further solve this. This can be x plus 4, and this can be x minus 4, right? This one, you're gonna, if you were to solve this, you would get x squared equals a -16. So guys, what would your solutions be for this one? 4i, right? So that would be x plus 4i, x minus 4i. So guys, when I do my number line, this one would be, if you were to solve this one, you would get plus or minus 4. Let's just focus on the -4 and the +4. Okay, you can't put negative or i's on your number line because they're not real numbers. Okay, so we're just going to focus on -4 and 4. We don't really have to pay attention to this. Okay, so let's see what real numbers we can have. So for this side, if I plugged in a -5 here and a -5 here, I would get -1 times -9, which is positive, correct? So that works because we want to be greater than or equal to 0. If I plug in a number between -4 and 4, let's try plugging in a 0 and see what happens. So we'll plug in a 0 this time. If I plug in 0, 0, I get 4 times a -4. That's negative. And that's not what I want. I want to be greater than or equal to 0. So we don't want this middle part. Let's plug in numbers bigger than 4. So let's try plugging in a 5 this time. If I plug in a 5, guys, what will I get? Plug in a 5 here, I get 9. Plug in a 5 here, I get 1. 9 times 1 is positive. So it looks like my interval is this side and this side. So my interval will be -infinity to -4 and 4 to infinity. That is my solution interval. Number 3, you should have moved this over. So this will be x squared minus 6x minus 91. And if you do an eye chart, you should have gotten -13 and +7. Those will multiply to -91, but add to -6. So these are your factors, meaning your solutions are at -7 and +13. Now, guys, this is less than or equal to 0 this time. So we want numbers that are less than 0, meaning we want negatives this time. So let's plug in a number. Let's plug in between -7 and 13. Let's plug in a 0. If you plug in 0, you get -13 times 7. That gives you a negative answer. So we know we want this interval. Let's plug in -8. So if I plug in a -8 here, what will I get? If I plug in a -8 and a -8, won't I get two negatives? So that would be positive. We don't want this side then. And if I plug in 14, so 14 and 14, what do I get? Uh-oh. I get positive? Yeah, if I plug in a 14 here and a 14 here, I get a positive answer. We don't want positive answers. We want to be less than or equal to 0. So this is my interval solution. It'll be between -7 and 13. It'll be brackets because it says less than or equal to 0. Okay, so if I were to solve this, I would get x equals 4 and x equals -3. So on my number line, you should have -3 and a 4. So let's go ahead and test some numbers. I'm going to test on the left side of -3. So let's test -4. I'll plug in a -4 here and a -4 here. So -4 minus 4 is -8. But if you square it, won't it become positive? Yeah. So this will be a positive times, let's see what we get over here. -4 plus 3, that's a -1 to the power of 3. Will that be negative or positive? Negative. Well, a positive and a negative make a negative. So to the left of -3, you would be negative if you plug in numbers. Okay, now we're going to try numbers between -3 and 4. What shall I plug in? Between -3 and 4. I'll just do 0. Thank you. So if I plug in zeros, I'll get -4 squared, which would be 16. That's positive. And then 3 cubed, is that positive? Yep. So I get two positives. A positive times a positive, this will be positive between -3 and 4. Okay, now let's test numbers to the right of 4. So let's plug in a 5. So this time I'm going to plug in a 5. A 5 here and a 5 here. It looks like I'm going to get 1. If you square it, you just get 1. And then 5 plus 3, that's 8. If you cube it, you get a positive number. A positive times a positive is positive. Okay, so our problem said that they want x values that will yield less than 0. So we can't get this side because those are positive values. Those are bigger than 0. We want this side. Negative numbers are less than 0. So that means your interval is -infinity to -3. Will I use a parenthesis or a bracket? A parenthesis, because we have a less than symbol. We do not have a less than or equal to symbol, so it should be a parenthesis on -3. We cannot equal 0. Okay? All right, let's try number 6. Number 6, you should have split it down the middle to factor it. So x squared will be out here, plus 5. Here you divided by -9, so -9 is on the outside, and you get x plus 5. These match. What is on the outside will go in its own parenthesis. We can, that should be a 9. Okay, we can continue factoring this. This can be x plus 3 times x minus 3, and then x plus 5. So these are our factors. Our answers, if it was equal to 0, would be -3, +3, and -5. So I'm going to put those on my number line. We'll say -5 is here, -3 is here, and +3 is over here. Okay, so let's test some numbers. I'm going to plug in -6. This would give you a negative number. This would give you a negative number. And this would give you a negative number. 3 negatives, that would be negative. Let's test a number between -5 and -3. Okay. All right, so we'll plug in, you guys said -4, so I'll plug in -4 for these x values. So I would get negative, negative, and a positive. Well, these two negatives make a positive times another positive. This is positive. Okay, now let's try a number between -3 and 3. Any number between -3 and 3, we're going to test. We'll just do 0. That would be easy. Plug in zeros. So I would get a positive number here, a negative number here, and a positive number here. Positive and a negative is negative, times a positive is still negative. So that was negative. Now let's try numbers bigger than 3. So I'll plug in 4. And we'll see what happens. So plug in a 4, 4, and a 4. This is positive, that's positive, and that's positive. So if you multiply 3 positives together, you'll get positive. So our original problem, it says be less than 0. So which one of these are less than 0? Yep. And -3 to 3. Can we be equal to 0? Okay, so we're not going to equal these. We're going to use parentheses. So this will be negative infinity to -5 with the parenthesis because we cannot equal -5. -5, if you plug it in, you get 0. And -3 to 3, parenthesis, not a bracket.